Hello, I'm Grant, and welcome to Second Plate, a cooking show all about reusing ingredients and using staples you might have just on hand in your kitchen. So tonight we're going to be making black bean soup. It's kind of like similar to chili, but the reason I want to do this is I always seem to have like one can of black beans in my cabinet that I would just basically fall back to if I had nothing else to kind of like work with. So for this recipe, I specifically wanted to have things that were canned, or you can get canned. So it's a great thing to kind of pull out if you did no shopping. It's basically nothing in here is going to go bad. So it's just a really nice recipe to have literally in the back of your cabinet, just kind of pull out and throw anything extra you might have in. All right, so let's go ahead and get cooking. One thing I feel like I've definitely learned is I always try to open my cans first. I have made the mistake many times where I will say, like I am going to in a minute here, start sauteing some veggies over in my pot, and then I turn and like, oh, I got to open up my can. And I actually have a new can opener, but previously I had this really rusted one that just took maybe like a minute and a half, and I noticed that in the time it took me to open up 2 cans, basically all my veggies were burning. So I just wanted to call that out, how I try to get that all open and ready to go beforehand. Also, this is just something where I like little tips and tricks for the kitchen that are useful, and sometimes they're really simple. One thing I always really liked was, generally when you open a can, you'll go ahead and do it like this, where I'm gonna go basically cut on the inner seam. But I thought it was interesting how someone just pointed out to me that they always cut theirs like this. And it's just this weird, interesting alternative where on one hand, it's a little bit more dangerous because it's going to give a very sharp edge to this can. However, what it does do is you never have this situation where it's stuck, like the lid is stuck inside the can itself. I'm not particularly good with can openers in general. There we go. And I just think it's kind of nice as an alternative because it just basically lifts off really cleanly and you don't have to go fishing for it actually inside the can. I don't always do it because again, I don't love the fact that it gives you that really hard metal edge, but I think it is something that's kind of cool to know about. Anyway, I'm going to go through what's kind of actually in this dish. So black beans, that's kind of like our base. We're going to be cooking them in chicken broth. Other than that, I have some corn, garlic, I have green onions, I have a orange bell pepper, my favorite kind of bell pepper, even though it really doesn't matter. And then I'm also going to be adding, like I said, some corn and 2 serrano peppers, as well as some lime juice, as well as I'm going to actually serve it with the wine ledge. And I want to talk about peppers because like this is something where I varied the most when I was practicing this, is like what kind of heat to put in this. I didn't want to use jalapenos because I feel like that's the go-to. And obviously the bell pepper is not really going to bring much to it. And I've tried this with several different ones. I like serrano because they're small, they're easy, they're cheap. They are hotter than jalapenos, I believe. But it just seemed like really a nice way to get a simple little bit of heat in your dish without having to chop a bunch of peppers. Like I also used Anaheim peppers, which are these like really giant looking jalapenos basically. And those work pretty well because they don't have as much, they're not as hot as a jalapeno. But I feel like I wanted to specifically have them add heat. I didn't want to add mass because like that's kind of what the bell pepper is going to be doing. So that's why I use these in particular. So I'm going to go ahead and start chopping these just on like so. And actually at one point I saw several recipes. What they did for heat is they would have adobo sauce, which is like this meat marinade that was originally designed, if I understand correct, to preserve meats in very hot weather. And that actually worked. It came out okay. But one thing I really didn't like about using the adobo sauce is red. And I kind of want my soup to stay black because it's a black bean soup. Whereas if it starts looking red, it ends up being kind of just this, like it looks like it should be a chili, but it's not. So it's just something where I basically omitted it, not because of a lack of flavor or anything, but just I didn't like the color of it. And on that same note, later on, I'm going to actually be blending some of the soup in order to give it the kind of like a creamy consistency. Well, at one point, I should start with, one of the things I like about this is you can basically throw any veggies you want into the soup itself. So I was making it one time and I had leftover peas. So I just threw those in. And then that's all fine, tasted perfectly fine. However, I went to blend it, and when you blend the peas, it gives it this like really sickly green color. And again, tasted fine, but it didn't look the best. And I think it's something where it's just, I don't know, it's some of the stuff you would just get from like cooking this dish and experience, like, oh, I didn't think about that. Or maybe I would not want to serve it to guests even if I would be okay having it myself. So I'm just de-seeding this. I'm pretty sure you can have the seeds in, but it's not going to hurt. But I don't know if there's any great way to do this. I like to just kind of cut them down and I'll just peel them off. You can actually just wash it off, that works, but then you kind of lose the heat a little bit. But I think it's kind of personal preference. I usually end up just running like a knife or to cut off these white ribbing or just to kind of like knock away the seeds. Really, it's up to you. It's something where it's like, I know there's got to be a way to do it really cleanly and fast, but I just can't seem to find it. I'm the same way with garlic, which is an annoyance because I use garlic in like everything I cook. But there just seems to be no good catch-all way that can just clear out all the garlic, like all the, skin, shavings, what have you. Okay, so just chop these up quickly. This is another dish where you will quickly find if you have any cuts on your hand, because this pepper will definitely point them out to you. Another thing is always call out, careful what you touch after you cut these. So I'm going to try really hard not to say, touch my eye after cutting these. So I'm going to start actually cooking the vegetables now. So I just have some olive oil that I'm going to go ahead and put in my pan. I'm just going to set this, say about medium, and put in about a tablespoon or two and let that heat up. I'm going to start with my onions and then my garlic, and then I'm going to slowly add basically the other veggies, so my bell peppers, my corn, stuff like that. And then after that's all done and kind of like sauteed, then I'm going to bring in the actual black beans. And then once those are all good and going, that's when I'm going to start like spicing it. So I have cumin, I have chili powder. I'm actually going to saute some red pepper flakes along with this. Honestly, I honestly wanted to do this recipe because I wanted to have a recipe where I judge it as I cook. I continue to just taste test it. So that's what I'm going to be trying to do, and it seems to have worked out pretty well so far. Okay, very good. So garlic and onions. I have a pretty uncertain amount because, again, I want to taste it as I go. So I actually have garlic powder as well if I want to further increase the heat. Next, I'm going to actually add my serranos, toss those in, and some red pepper flakes. This should be good, but I'm guessing between all these, it's going to be a fair bit of spice. It's hard to tell though, and that's why I wanted to specifically make sure I taste test a recipe like this, because peppers in general can be very random. Like you'll get a jalapeno that's just ridiculous, and then the next one is basically a dud. So I don't want to overdo it on the red pepper flakes yet, because for all I know, this may be incredibly hot for spiciness once I get to cooking. I need to be careful not to stand over that because, God, just the heat, the spiciness, I can feel it in my eyes when I stir. Okay, get that going. And go ahead and toss in some of my bell peppers. I like orange, not for any particular reason, but why I chose orange for this dish is I just try to get a lot of different colors into it. So I figured, okay, I got green. I'm going to be adding some tomatoes. That's going to be my red. So then orange seemed like a natural little choice. Pepper. Going to go add my corn. This is canned. Again, that was kind of the point. I have drained this. I think one thing that's particularly hard for me to manage is the amount of liquid in the soup, because the majority of my liquid is going to be coming from the broth itself. And I see some recipes where they have just a huge amount of just broth. And I think that's because it doesn't account for things like, okay, the extra juice from, say, the corn I'm going to put in, or say, I guess if you wanted to cut it with some water or use a thicker broth. It's just, there's all this variance. So I'm going to be basically eyeballing that to try and keep it exactly with what I want. Okay. Got some charred tomatoes. Toss it. This is a new addition. Previously, I would always use cut up tomatoes, but I saw a recommendation to use these kind of like flame broiled ones, and I didn't want to flame broil them myself. But yeah, kind of spread that so they kind of stew together, and then I'm going to let my pan heat back up. It is something that's interesting where I've noticed it a lot on this show that I have to account for is when I'm making a giant pan, even at home, where I have like a fairly decently sized pot to my oven, when you do stuff like say add chicken broth, that's a big thing I noticed with soup is the chicken broth, when you add it, it's going to completely lower the temperature of the soup and you have to like heat up again. So that's why I kind of like adding a little, stir a little bit, add a little, stir, and then I'll have to do a whole thing where I bring it to a boil so it can simmer. But unless you have a really amazing kitchen where you can have like a gas stove. I don't have that, sadly. But basically I just kind of keep this around here. I'm trying to keep it fairly light. Like I believe when I saw other recipes call to saute it, I've always kind of kept the heat a little bit lower and didn't cook too much because I've just had this fear that by the time I saute it, and let's say I saute it perfectly done, then when I have to let it simmer, it's going to end up being soggy. I haven't ever had that happen, but I have a feeling that by basically cooking it twice, if I don't leave room for it to like have more cook time, I have that fear. So plus I'm going to go ahead and just make sure these peppers are in. Cool. I think cooking with peppers is something I want to do more often. It's very interesting. I know one thing I invested in for the sake of cooking this dish is I would have just milk around or yogurt, I believe can work as well. Just anything so like when you taste test this, you have something to help kill the spiciness. So that's just something I thought was kind of interesting. And I would actually say if I were to serve this for a meal, serve it with that. Maybe not the yogurt, but to have something that's designed where like, if it comes out really spicy, to help kill that. Perfect, we're heating back up again. And I wouldn't mind if some of this liquid boiled off because I'm probably gonna have to omit a little bit of the chicken broth because I'll have basically this liquid, I'm gonna have the black beans, I put them in with the water. I know it is possible to drain them. I personally haven't done it, but you can use this recipe with dried beans. You just have to kind of cook it a little bit longer so that they soak stuff in. But the whole goal of this was like, again, I wanted to have something I could literally have in my cabinet and I could just pull out and make. And then like every other thing where it's like, oh, I have some leftover bell peppers, toss those in. Got some leftover onions, toss those in. But I think my next goal is to try this or any recipe with those dried beans. Because like that's a great thing where like it's dried, super cheap to get just in a huge amount. And as long as you have the concept behind how the dish works, you don't have to like worry about what you put in or the amounts. It's basically just something you can make super quickly and just throw in whatever you need. That's kind of one thing I kind of like about soup is you just throw in what you have. Like, sure, you can go a whole big route and like, okay, I'm going to spice like this, I'm going to season it, I'm going to have these specific things. But I think when I was working on it, what I appreciated most, it was being able to be like, oh, I have so much garlic, I have to find some use for it. Well, I can throw it all into here. Okay, I have, once again, a ton of onions. Let me just throw this all straight in here. And it made a really good amount. So, and that's another thing I think I'm going to talk about is this makes a lot, just as I continue adding more and more stuff. This is something where you make, say, on like a Sunday, and then you just have leftovers for days, and you can just keep going back. And I actually got to a point where sometimes I would essentially pull out my leftovers, I'd put the stove on, and I'll kind of reheat it and like cook in new ingredients. It's something that's really flexible for how simple it is. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add in my beans. But going back to size and amount of this recipe, one of the things I was trying to tackle was specifically finding ways to get it down. Because like one reason I mentioned, say, using the dried beans is then you could use a very exact amount. Whereas using canned beans, you're basically stuck using a whole can. Like you could, say, have like leftovers, I guess, and save it for another recipe, but that seems like a lot of extra work when you're already gonna have leftovers of the soup. Cool. So I'm gonna let that start simmering before I add my broth, and I'm gonna go in and add some spices. So I'm going to add chili powder, I have cumin, salt, pepper, and of course the red pepper flakes as well. They're already in there. So this is going to be just nice stir. I know I need some salt, but until I actually get in there and start tasting it, I don't want to put in too much because you can't take it out. And depending on what ingredients you have, it's very easy to oversalt a soup, I would assume, because I bought all stuff that was like salt-reduced chicken broth. I made sure that, say, my corn's not salted. I believe my tomatoes are. And I just know, like, if you didn't pay attention to that and you dump all those in, and then you dump in a ton of salt, you may realize this is way saltier than I intended. And then the only real way to undo that is to, say, add more mass. So, like, if you do that, I would say put in more chicken broth. That's the easiest way to kind of like cut it down. But it's something I wanted to call out because it's very easy to mess that up when you can also just always add more. So this is just 1 teaspoon of the chili powder. I'm actually going to go fairly light on this because, again, I don't know quite how those peppers are. I'm expecting that it might be hotter than I want it to be already, just based off of when I was actually cutting my serrano peppers. Keep stirring. Then cumin. Cumin's interesting. I have an interest in it. Like, there's so many foods that seem to use it, and I can tell. It's like if you taste it, it's like, oh, I recognize that taste. So it's something I've been trying to purposely put into some more of my dishes, because it was something like growing up I never thought to use or like did use. But yeah, okay, let's keep stirring this. Perfect. Like, I don't even know what cumin is, to be honest. I just know it's like when I would like open it and smell it or like taste it, it was basically, it's the spice that, how to put it, like its flavor is just the flavor of like every good burrito I've ever had. So I was like, oh, let me keep putting in more and more of that. Okay, we got a good base going here. Smells good, so I'm going to go ahead and taste this quickly before I add my broth. Okay, there's definitely some heat, but it's not nearly as bad as I was kind of fearing. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and put in some more of that chili powder. Probably a fair bit because I'm about to add more stuff. A little bit more cumin, pepper, salt. And I'm using basically the salt I put on, say, my like steaks and stuff. I have tried doing different things like using kosher salt or using very fine salt. I don't have the skill level to tell you exactly how different they are in cooking, but it's something that's worth looking into. Perfect. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add my chicken broth and a lime. So I'm going to be using some of this over there. So let me just wedge this while this heats up so it can be served. And then the other half of the lime, I'm actually going to be squeezing into this, which is something fairly new, but I think it should be good. I always want to use more limes. I think they're neat, you know, and they're fairly cheap. I really do need to get a juicer though. That would save me a lot of time. So, there. Now I'm going to add the chicken broth. And I can tell, like, particularly from the tomatoes, there's a fair bit of liquid here already, so I don't really need that much. But my rule normally was for when I was cooking this and there's not a lot of liquid, before basically I add the tomatoes, is I would try to fill it up enough with the chicken broth that you have maybe, say, half an inch to an inch up above the soup. And then if you need more because it's going to reduce, then you can just kind of add that in as you go. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and wait. I want this to come to a simmer. I'm going to let it kind of sit for about 10 to 20 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and get to the blender and serving it. So now that we got this simmer going, usually what I'll do is I'll just, fish some out. I'll taste test it, see what I kind of like, what I want. In particular, what I try to do is I'll get, say, a nice little section like that, and what I'll do is taste it, see like, oh, do I need more salt? And then I'll salt just this little thing until I kind of get it how I want it, and then add more, or like, a similar amount to the actual stuff, just to protect yourself from over salting something. Plus then I feel a little bit more comfortable like guessing. Like, oh, I think this needs salt, like, because I can usually tell, like, I need this, I'm just not sure how to get it, and that's a nice way to kind of try different things. Like, I'll put in, say, chili powder, and like, oh, I actually meant to put in, like, the cumin, but now I put in the chili powder. It's just a nice, easier way. So the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to take probably about a cup, and I'm going to put it in this blender, and I'm going to blend it. What this does is it changes the consistency of the soup. So if you want a really smooth, creamy one, then you'll blend more. If you basically just want to keep it as is, you don't have to do this. It's entirely optional. It's just something I wanted to call out because I think it's neat, honestly. And I don't use my blender nearly enough. But basically, the thing it's going to be chopping up is the black beans. I prefer a chunkier soup, just personally. And I did one where I purposely kind of over-blended it just to see how it would go. And it tastes fine. This doesn't really affect the flavor, but I didn't like how it looked, basically. Like, it was like it would form this seal as you took it off in the heat, and it was good, it was easy to eat, but like it just wasn't quite right. Cool. So basically gonna get something nice, simple, and we're just gonna add this right back in. And you can tell like it's just creamier and easier. But again, optional, you don't have to do this. It's something where I could see some people maybe not liking the look of the blended stuff. And I had mentioned earlier that I had at one point put peas in and blended them, and the results were not the best. But it's not a big deal. Again, err on the side of caution, I'd say, because you can always go blend more. Cool. But it should be about done here. One of the nice strengths of this dish is since I'm not actually putting in any meat, all the cooking is really doing is just making sure all the veggies are cooked through and just kind of letting them stew together. I can basically, you could probably eat it like right off the bat as long as you have your chicken broth having cooked for a couple minutes. But you can't really overdo it. I will say, on that note though, when I made this one time, I purposely tried to hurry it up by putting it on really high heat, and I ended up with this really weird taste because basically I had burnt the beans. Like the soup itself wasn't burnt, but just the beans, and you could just tell that even though it was edible, like that flavor of just burnt veggies and beans just kind of like permeated all throughout it. Cool, so next I'm going to take my soup. As I said before, I'm going to put on lime wedges because it just seems like it's fun. I use the lime anyway. You can put more into the soup when you have it. But it's a nice little garnish, especially because at this point you can't really see much green left anymore. I know some places recommended that you serve it with cilantro on top, or even some sour cream, depending on how yours came out. This is definitely a very veggie-heavy soup. I was trying to lean more into that than just the black beans, although I still want to go back and like do a really black bean-heavy soup so that I can have that really nice, deep black. Like that seems like just interesting to me because like to have such a like awesome color like that, it just implies, I think, a certain quality to the dish. Same like if you were to cook like a white food, like having food come out entirely white implies a certain amount of like quality, because otherwise it's so easy to have all the colors muddled together. To keep them like nice and separate, I feel like that takes a lot of planning. So here we have our black bean soup with tomatoes, corn, some lime, and it's got a little bit of heat. This would be a good time just to throw on any final spices, maybe put out some salt, like salt, pepper. I would probably serve this with chili powder. I wouldn't put out like say cumin or anything, but like let people give the heat if they want it. Plus what I think is kind of fun about this dish is overall you get the heat from the serrano peppers, but then when you actually hit the peppers, you know, it's like a little bit of variance. I don't want the whole soup to be too blended. So here we go, our final